Thanks, Joe, for that great introduction, and thank you, and thank Mari for inviting us here, and thank you all for coming. We're especially excited to be talking about this here in Vancouver, where it seems like these things are somehow especially close to the surface, and we just want to welcome you all to participate later on in tonight's exchange. Okay, so the Underdome Guide to Energy Reform, as Joe was mentioning, is a book about architecture and the politics of energy. We started thinking about this book in the early years of the Obama presidency, when the whole idea of a stimulus bill just started to make us wonder, what if all these barriers to achieving true architectural sustainability that we always worry about, what about all these kind of political constraints, these market pragmatics, and so on? If those were all to fall away and architects were to gain actual power, would we even know what to do with it? So doing this kind of thought experiment reminded us of the utopian projects of the 1960s with their totalizing ambitions and their science fiction levels of speculation. We began to think about domes. Domes, as you know, are symbols of utopia. And as we learned in the movie Biodome, starring Pauly Shore, domes also regulate climates. By producing a maximum interior volume with a minimum surface, they're the geometrically simplest way to enclose a volume, to enclose an interior environment. But domes are also sites of contention. As we learned in that important meditation on global resource management called Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, they have long been used as sites of competitive spectacle. So we see domes as a kind of concentrated form of sustainability. They are simultaneously technologies of energy management and symbols of possible even utopian futures. Not by chance, these enclosures also represent the image of the planet, or as Fuller famously called it, Spaceship Earth. Okay, turning to our book then, when we use the term underdome to convey the fact that all buildings today are similarly devices of environmental conditioning and stages for debate. As both Biodome and Thunderdome, they create atmospheric enclosures that also define new associations of people. We thus want to ask how energy management techniques in architecture organize publics and resources. In our book, we look at examples that may not always look like self-contained bubbles, but the question of how they attempt to close loops vis-a-vis larger urban and rural networks remains relevant throughout the book.
Hi, everyone. So first we thought we'd look at a couple of examples from architectural history. So Buckminster Fuller, for example, argued that designing a house like it is a spaceship could kind of usher in a new kind of life for its inhabitants. So he mocked architects who courted clients by building homes that were more informed by stylistic affectation than by performance. And in contrast, his own designs for Dymaxion House, for things like the Dymaxion house prototype shown here, would orchestrate chemical bonds and balance stresses and strains according to a logic of systems. What we sometimes forget, too, is that Fuller's vision was also a financial one. He proposed a housing subscription service that would manufacture, lease, and then deliver prefab houses designed for off-the-grid living. As historian Jonathan Massey writes in Underdome, Fuller's goal was to liberate families from dependence on roads and utilities, as well as the financial systems, such as mortgage loans, that bound individuals in a modern form of serfdom, in Jonathan Massey's words. So Fuller's subscribers could thus roam free from the risks taken on by average citizens who themselves live in glass boxes heated by radiators and even abandoned by wives who had to enter the workforce to help pay for it all. The house in the Demaxian house, in contrast, would arrange services and labor-saving devices around a central core. And in one depiction shown here, this allows kids to play while their father is at work, and their mother lies naked on the couch, which you could see. Yes, you can see here. So though tethered to a new kind of infrastructural utility and reliant on the continuation of patriarchal family values, the house also conceived ways to facilitate new levels of freedom from work, debt, and even neighborly surveillance. These are priorities that are legible in everything from its funding model to its detailing. And yet, not all domes are the same. And creating a very different form of collectivity was Fuller's 1960 proposal with Shoji Sadao for a 2-mile wide dome over Midtown Manhattan, a massive architectural surface that would regulate the city's ecosystems. They delivered this design with a very surprising set of calculations. The dome would reduce heat loss by scaling the city's surface area to 1/85th of its current status. The elimination of snow plowing alone would pay for heat. Buildings inside the dome could be built cheaper without need for weatherproofing. And interior air could, in theory, be heated by remote power plants. If this grand scheme sounds to you like technocratic megalomania, you're probably right. But what interests us here is that the design proposes to repurpose efficiency in order to redraw the public. So by creating an overarching surface, the dome would dislodge architecture from its conventional identification as a boundary between public and private, but then liberated from their obligation to keep out rain and snow, buildings would then be able to recombine and reconfigure a new kind of massive and public interior. And this would make visible a kind of redistribution of real costs and benefits to a much more expansive citizenry than is currently implied by the Manhattan street grid. So as we see in the libertarian potential of the Demaxian house, as well as the social collectivity implied by the dome over Manhattan, the simple device of the dome, when scaled up or scaled down, broken apart, or armed with kind of valves and thermostats, can help us describe a spectrum of ideas about energy and public interest. In a sense, both projects would have depended on outside networks. So whether, in the first case, a sprawling home delivery system, or in the second, a network of Pennsylvania power plants. But given these realities, how might we be able to speculate on the effects of these different models?
Okay, so this book is a cross between an architect's handbook and a voter's guide. We've mapped out a broad range of approaches to energy reform that, in the book, and we think that in any attempt to solve our ongoing energy crisis, technical and natural systems must also be considered as simultaneously scientific and political. Solutions like LEED standards in the US and green sourcing depend on faith in the so-called invisible hand of the market, as well as mantras like hands off Mother Nature. But nature and the market operate politically precisely by presenting themselves as above politics. By being explicit about all this, we hope to draw these phantoms back into the political fold. It should be clear that this does not mean rejecting things like efficiency or markets, but rather questioning the terms of performance. As beyond such metrics as carbon and dollars, material and square footages, what if we also optimize variables like housing availability, species counts, and resource equity? So to facilitate this kind of debate, we began thinking about this. We began the project by creating an online database of existing responses to climate and energy crises. These responses included both ideas and objects, as well as laws and buildings, and their sources ranged from people like President Jimmy Carter to architect Bjarke Ingels. And then to test and challenge our map of possibilities, we organized a series of symposia bringing together representatives from architecture, landscape design, urban planning, engineering, policy, business, history, economics, and journalism. We then reconfigured our map based on these discussions. So we rendered different approaches to energy reform as individual domes. As in Mad Max, these positions we found formed a shifting pattern of alliances and conflicts. We positioned each dome on a structuralist grid within one of 4 regimes which structured architectural agency, those being power, territory, lifestyle, and risk. Now, power, shown on your left, asks who rules and who is ruled by energy regimes. How do governments, corporations, organizations, individuals each have the power to affect energy performance? And then next, a vertical axis then positions the grassroots against centralized control. So, yeah, we can see that. Well, a horizontal axis sweeps from markets to regulations. As for the other regimes, territory, shown on your right, looks at the shape and expanded networks of the contemporary metropolis. Lifestyle describes public norms and behaviors, and risk asks how we can collectively respond to the uncertainty and the threat of climate-related disasters. For each topic in the book, we've included essays and transcripts of the panel discussions alongside a visual guide. And in the visual guide, we've illustrated each political agenda as a case study, illustrating architectural strategies in more detail in order to see the connections between ideas and objects, as well as the ways in which the buildings and built artifacts often diverge from clear intentions. And so we'll take a look at those now.
So today we thought we'd take a closer look at some of the agendas that we've drawn out in our book and ask through them which publics and which natures these schemes propagate. So if Fuller managed to be both libertarian and communitarian, equally compelling to the Pentagon and to Haight-Ashbury, in a curious way, our current American presidential primary season, and tonight's a big night for that, has produced a comparable tension. Political parties trumpet populist individualism while relying on centralizations of political power in sometimes less visible arenas. This is a debate illustrated by the following 2 positions, even if they might look similar at first glance. So, for example, faced with a threat of a warming planet, we could provide and leverage government power to implement construction projects, or we could smash the state and clear new ground for political autonomy. So going back to the first case, the first image illustrates the Federal Weatherization Assistance Program, or WAP, which uses public funds to renovate the dwellings of low-income households. Whereas most energy efficiency incentives only work for homeowners, WAP works with tenants as well, at sites ranging from rural homes to public housing towers. And the project essentially smuggles in funding from the Department of Energy to public housing programs that are otherwise underfunded. WAP upgrades equipment and improves weatherproofing measures, shown here as the installation of spray foam insulation within the facade. In contrast, then, the Citadel is a proposed separatist community in Idaho for families who want to escape the confines of paternalistic government and gain control over their own means of survival. So this walled, self-sufficient city would enable its citizens to live without fear of natural disaster, grid failure, or maybe most important, taxation. So Citadel's residents would work at a firearms company called 3 Arms in order to support the venture. And then in return, each home would be supplied with a 2,500-gallon water tank, 1 year's supply of food, 1 or 2 AR-15 variant rifles with 1,000 rounds of ammunition each, a generator, a composting toilet, a vault, and a protective safe room that you can see in this drawing. So both projects have generic pitched roofs and green lawns. They both buffer conditioned interiors from the world outside, whether by reskinning buildings layer by layer or by protecting valuables behind bunker walls. But of course, there are also differences between the two. While the Citadel tries to make political and social autonomy coincident with its own isolated infrastructure, WAP peels away layers of responsibility and risk from building assemblies and assigns a share directly to the state. What makes the Citadel puzzling, I think, is not just that it manifests some sort of version of Sarah Palin urbanism, but that it uses the same rhetoric as green design. So its ideologies of self-sufficiency and resource independence can't quite so easily be dismissed. We see this rhetoric resonate in otherwise antithetical projects, such as New York City's Bank of America Tower, which you see here. And in this case, the architects Cook and Fox had to acquire permits for a dedicated natural gas pipeline into Manhattan to fuel an efficient cogeneration plant. So these private power plants and backup generators start to carve up the city into urban resource islands, even as today's smart grid also enables building owners to sell energy back up to the grid, through the grid. We've named this position Compete, as you can see up here, as it exemplifies faith in the theory of natural capitalism. In other words, by retuning the free market's self-regulating mechanisms, one can make energy performance profitable. So this LEED Platinum building champions the potential of voluntary certification regimes, and it does so by resolving trade-offs between sustainability measures like cogeneration, ice chillers, and gray water recycling, with the client's demand for luxuries like a full glass facade and executive offices along the building's perimeter, as you can see here. These were non-negotiable perks for the developer and client, despite the architect's suggestion that an open office would actually save more energy. And of course, let's not forget that mortgage loans helped pay for all of this, even though LEED, of course, doesn't award us for foreclosing someone's home. So moving on to a couple of other examples, while the Bank of America design expresses corporate control, the recent renovation of a very different New York City icon also shows how local governments have been regulating landlords in order to make end users, kind of consumers, more directly accountable. So in 2009, the Greener Greater Buildings Plan passed by the New York City Council tightened energy code restrictions for building renovations. So in contrast to island enclaves like Bank of America, this program introduced tenant sub-metering arrangements to some of the city's largest buildings. And in this way, individualized arrangements or controls have started to create patchworks of microclimate zones. And at the Hudson Yards redevelopment as well, in Midtown Manhattan, state energy incentives have also encouraged its owners, the related companies and Oxford Properties, to implement cogeneration and campus-wide smart systems. So these are controls that can create new efficiencies by allowing free market heat exchange between commercial and residential buildings. And in San Francisco's Transbay Terminal as well, creative state incentives have upzoned land freed for development by the demolition of the Embarcadero Freeway in order to fund the creation of a new center for public transit in the region. So these buildings are all simultaneously icons of capital and of green design. They showcase the power of self-sufficiency, efficiency, self-regulation, smartness, and density. Their iconic towers speak the language of corporate preeminence, even while their construction and renovation have also been subsidized by government programs. And at a closer glance, the Hudson Yards' famous platform over the MTA rail yards and the Transbay's rooftop park stretched above vaulted waiting rooms start to model a new kind of megastructure, which I think is great because we're sitting in a megastructure today. And through them, architecture reifies financial arrangements between state and corporation, while forming, as we said in our introduction, new icons of civic space. These projects illustrate how the mission of government has drifted over time, from development to regulation to benchmarking and subsidies. So in one sense, governments continue to expand bureaucracies while waging wars motivated by energy markets. In another, energy landscapes are marked in tangible ways by the withdrawal of the state, in conditions reminiscent of even Thomas Edison's private Gilded Age electrical networks. And today, as well, many of us now experience the state as something more of a personal trainer who uses incentives and incrementalism to nudge along urban practices. So Erik will give some examples of this kind of turn as well.
Okay. With the outsourcing of governance to the individual comes the idea that climate change is a matter of personal responsibility. Take, for example, the Energy Hog program, a public awareness campaign commissioned by the Alliance to Save Energy with funding from the Home Depot and the U.S. Department of Energy. This program distributes games and educators' guides for teaching children the value of energy efficiency, along with cartoons to depict the wasteful habits of characters, including Boss Hog and his friends Kelvin Bacon and Morik Pork. In the video games, children gain points by running around a house to close windows and screw in fluorescent light bulbs, and even install insulation in the attic. The idea here is that the power to change consumption rests in the hands of tiny consumers. In maybe a parallel way, the tiny home movement celebrates a simpler life, one which is modest and debt-free. Companies like the Tumbleweed Tiny House Company fabricate 400 square foot houses with a maximum width of 8 foot 6 inches. I guess that's about 2.6 meters. This allows homeowners to tow the structures to just about any site in the country without needing an oversized trailer permit. But this new lifestyle seems, if it seems too aesthetic to some people, Bjarke Ingels famously promises that saving energy doesn't always have to be painful. Only by making it fun, by offering what he calls hedonistic sustainability, can we make it popular. His firm, Big's W57 apartment building in New York, boasts a communal garden as well as daylighting in every unit. But perhaps most importantly, the building cleverly outsources pain in order to gain pleasure at home. As you can see here, W57, which has still yet to acquire any kind of LEED ratings, shares a wastewater recycling system with a building called the Helena, which is next door, and is a LEED Gold certified tower built by the same developer, the Durst organization. In exchange for this, W57's signature form sweeps back in order to preserve views of the Hudson River. Okay. So projects like the Energy Hog and the Tiny Home movement reimagine consumption through a language of purchasing power. But they also go further and suggest a more significant side of power. They imagine new public norms and ethical behaviors. They create a new aesthetics of sustainability poised between restraint and delight. They define class boundaries. And they define new structures of domestic and working life. To take this further, if Fuller's Dymaxion house reinforces sanctity of the nuclear family, spaces like these accessory dwelling units, also called granny flats, hint that single-family homes don't fit the way we actually live today. From elderly parents to domestic workers, these arrangements could promote urban density, assist aging in place, and increase affordability, though perhaps at the risk of stigmatizing the backyard dweller. In parallel, the Salt River Project in Arizona exemplifies a different kind of post-nuclear life, post-nuclear family life, this time as off-the-grid living. This utility company pioneered a prepay plan called the Empower Price Plan. It has benefited sunbirds who can unplug from summer homes in, say, Wisconsin or Michigan, and then plug into winter homes in RV parks in the Sonoran Desert. The utility boasts that these plans also encourage customers to conserve energy in order to avoid having their power shut off. But significantly too, these kind of prepaid plans are also designed for households that have such bad credit that they can't open a conventional account with a utility company. In this sense, the personalization of responsibility goes hand in hand with the personalization of risk, leaving the most vulnerable clients literally in the dark. So far, we've looked at strategies that represent contentious roles of governance, whether collective or internalized. Along with questioning the role of government, we also need to consider who is being governed, who or what communities are being represented. So questions of diversity will then raise issues about scales, networks, and relationships that can defy common political structures. So let's turn to diversity first. In the mid-1970s, governments began to talk about biological diversity as a resource which they needed to conserve. In 1976, the U.S. transferred the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska from the Navy to the Department of the Interior. Parts of it were then set aside for birds and caribou, which resulted in the drawing of complex boundaries to balance the imagined value of the animals and the ecosystems versus that of the oil. Based directly on this model of biological conservation, NGOs subsequently started to speak of conserving based directly on the model of biological conservation, NGOs started to speak of preserving cultural or human diversity. While we're currently witnessing a kind of media frenzy in the US regarding refugees and their diverse traditions, some planners have been advocating precisely for more immigration, justified even on energy savings alone. Okay. So for example, Gulfton, Texas, a suburb of Houston, emptied out after the oil boom of the late 1970s, only to be repopulated by immigrants from Mexico, El Salvador, and Vietnam. And these immigrants reused the existing building stock while actually doubling the urban density. Okay, at what scale then we have to ask, does energy reform operate? Are big and small changes equally necessary in addressing a problem as global and massive as climate change? The Living City Block, for example, is a nonprofit associated with Amory Levin's Rocky Mountain Institute. It invests in energy upgrades at the scale of a city block. It thus acts as a middleman between utility companies and individual landlords to implement renovations that would be too expensive for single owners. In projects in Denver and Brooklyn, it plans to invest in things like PV panels, maglev turbines, cogeneration plants, block-wide recycling programs, edible shade trees, and even rooftop play areas with on-site childcare. So this approach adds a layer of green energy infrastructure onto what is basically a neo-traditional streetscape. And it works within the existing market to localize the benefits of energy upgrades and risk to a private enclave, which is larger than an individual but smaller than a city. In this way, attempts to expand connections among financial markets and human and material flows reveal new vulnerabilities and alliances. Okay. In this example, the National Flood Insurance Program, the U.S. federal government subsidizes flood insurance for homeowners in low-lying areas, provided that those municipalities have also curbed development in those areas. And so the idea here is that we must redesign liabilities so that groups responsible for hazards share risk with those who are exposed. So even the tax money of homeowners who live in, say, the Rocky Mountains subsidizes premiums of residents in the Everglades region. In 2012, Congress discontinued the program when it linked insurance to market rates, but it reinstated it after protests driven by the fact that annual premiums for individual homes skyrocketed tenfold. So whether bolstered by subsidized insurance markets or unified under the literal enclosure of Fuller's Dome over Manhattan, these dislocated landscapes and publics demonstrate the challenge of distributed risks of global climate change, and they question the scale of the response. Okay, one last poignant example illustrates the contingency of relationships between large and small actions. In Iraq, the U.S. Department of Defense struggled with loss of lives and resources that resulted from the shipment of oil into otherwise off-the-grid army bases. Here in Basra, the army started hosing spray foam insulation onto fabric tents, creating these kind of new fuzzy bubbles in the desert, which minimized the need for air conditioning. So even in a war motivated by oil, the need for efficiency was inescapable.
So today we've looked at examples that range from public housing retrofits to separatist compounds, from corporate enclaves to the open road, and from tethered landscapes to polyurethane fortresses. We can see that each project makes claims to efficiency and sustainability, but we can also witness here a vast panorama of answers to the question, who shall govern the land and on whose behalf? And architects, too, are active participants here. We design envelopes, enclaves, and standards, and in doing so help to reconstruct relationships between resources and publics. So while it might be tempting to frame the energy debate around efficiency equations entirely, we also hope that people will consider questions of inclusion and exclusion embedded within these approaches. Ultimately, we hope that architects and students will find this book both useful and provocative. We wanted to help those interested in discerning between the many claims around sustainability and cutting through greenwashing. But we also hope that this will be a resource for those thinking about an expanded form of practice in response to our current crisis. So with that, I think we'd like to open up any questions. We'd welcome any thoughts that you have. Thanks.